Why did American soldiers in Vietnam say they'd rather face 1,000 enemies in a firefight than walk through a single minefield? How did an enemy with no air force, no navy, and no tanks manage to inflict 750 casualties per week? On the world's most powerful military, how did 90% of American mine casualties come from weapons made with their own unexploded ordnance? You're going to hear all that and more through the brutal story of fighting the Viet Cong, an enemy that turned the jungle itself into a weapon and made every step a potential death sentence. The biggest problem American forces faced in Vietnam wasn't killing the enemy, it was finding him. As one military assessment grimly noted, the enemy steals from us the weapons of the 20th century and supplements them with the weapons of the 16th century. While Americans relied on massive firepower and technological superiority, the Viet Cong fought with bamboo stakes, crossbows, and an intimate knowledge of terrain that had been their home for generations. The National Liberation Front had perfected something that made conventional military doctrine completely useless. They were farmers by day and guerrillas by night, melting into the population when threatened, only to strike again when conditions favored them. Marine Captain John G. Miller captured the fundamental impossibility. No amount of American assistance can conquer an enemy which is everywhere and at the same time nowhere, an enemy of the people which has the sympathy and support of the people. But you'll now understand why this invisible enemy was about to become the stuff of nightmares for every American soldier who set foot in Vietnam. Vietnam's climate became as deadly as any weapon the Viet Cong possessed. Marine Captain Francis West described what American troops faced daily. Each rifleman carried 150 rounds of ammunition and 2 or more hand grenades. The platoon moved out at 1100. There was no breeze and no shade. The temperature was 102 degrees Fahrenheit. Within 5 minutes, every Marine was soaked in sweat. But the heat was just the beginning of nature's assault on American forces. The constant monsoon rains could swell wooden rifle stocks until triggers couldn't be fully depressed. Imagine your weapon failing when you need it most because of humidity. Metal components rusted so quickly that some units reported complete equipment failure within days of arrival. Radio batteries died in hours instead of their rated weeks. Even something as basic as writing became impossible when paper disintegrated in soldiers' hands. American troops, weighed down with 60-pound packs, flak jackets, and gear designed for temperate climates, moved at a crawl through jungle that sapped their strength with every step. Meanwhile, Viet Cong fighters wearing simple sandals made from discarded tires and carrying minimal equipment could cover the same distance in half the time. And while Americans struggled with malfunctioning equipment in oppressive heat, their enemies were about to demonstrate just how thoroughly they had mastered their environment. What made the Viet Cong truly terrifying was their ability to create an entire parallel world beneath the battlefield. The tunnel networks they constructed were engineering marvels born of desperation, and you're about to discover just how sophisticated these underground cities really were. At Cu Chi alone, nearly 200 miles of tunnels snaked underground in 3 distinct levels, some as shallow as 3 feet, others plunging 30 feet down. The upper levels housed living quarters and storage, while the deepest tunnels contained workshops where captured American weapons were repaired and modified. Kitchens used intricate ventilation systems that dispersed smoke through bamboo tubes extending hundreds of yards away, making detection from aircraft nearly impossible. These underground factories produced everything from sandals made of old tire treads to sophisticated booby traps. Some tunnel complexes even featured printing presses churning out propaganda, underground hospitals with operating rooms, and meeting halls that could accommodate dozens of fighters. The tunnel entrances were so expertly camouflaged that American soldiers could step directly on trapdoors without detecting them. Western journalist Wilfred Burchett, who lived with NLF forces, described the psychological impact. I was taken to inspect a single clump of bamboo and told to look very carefully for anything suspicious. Among the roots, I found nothing. Then I was taken into the tunnel and to a firing position, which could accommodate 3 or 4 people. Impossible for anyone to detect at even a few yards. But the real genius was in the details. Some tunnel sections could be flooded instantly to drown pursuers, while others contained underwater entrances accessible only by swimming through murky canals. The Viet Cong had literally created an invisible underground nation. But the most psychologically devastating aspect of Vietnam combat was something that haunted every step American soldiers took. Mines and booby traps accounted for 33% of all American casualties in Vietnam, and in some units, the numbers were catastrophically worse.
The kids who are brand new take the point, and they're the ones that disarm the mines. One of our kids, brand new in country, discovered a mine, and he went to uncover it, and he hit the wrong button on that mine, and it blew him to bits.
The 1st Marine Division reported that 57% of their casualties during the latter half of 1968 came from mines and booby traps alone.
And he found the mine, he was disarming the mine, and he set it off. He was the only one injured in that because as he was doing that, we all cleared the area. He was brand new. Sad truth, but that's the way, it's a numbers game.
But here's the cruelest irony you're about to hear. Most of these weapons were made from American ordnance, often within hours of being dropped. By 1969, the Pentagon admitted internally that 90% of all mine and booby trap components were of US origin. American bombing raids could leave behind over 20,000 tons of unexploded ordnance in a single year. 500-pound bombs, 155mm artillery shells, and mortar rounds that became raw materials for Vietnamese bomb makers. The process was as ingenious as it was deadly. Village workshops would carefully extract explosives from American duds, using techniques passed down through generations of miners. A single 500-pound bomb could yield enough explosive material for dozens of smaller devices. They learned to recognize the different fuse types, even developing color coding systems to identify which American ordnance was safe to handle and which would detonate if disturbed. August 6, 1970. Specialist Gordon Weiss was walking point when he stepped on a pressure release mine. The device was so sensitive that his 180-pound frame was enough to trigger it. Writing to his family from his hospital bed, missing most of his left leg and left hand, he captured the bitter reality. We kill more Americans with our own mines than we do anyone else. 2 days later, he was dead from complications, another casualty of American-made explosives turned against their creators. The Viet Cong had elevated psychological warfare to a sadistic art form, and you're about to understand why American morale crumbled under tactics designed to break minds as much as bodies. Booby traps weren't just weapons, they were instruments of terror calculated to destroy the will to fight, and their creators took perverse pride in their inventiveness. The bouncing Betty mine would launch itself 3 feet into the air before exploding at groin level, designed to maim rather than kill outright. Wounded soldiers required evacuation resources that dead ones didn't. Trapdoors on jungle trails, carefully camouflaged with leaves and dirt, led to beds of bamboo punji spikes coated with human excrement to guarantee fatal infections. These spikes were often fire-hardened to needle sharpness and angled upward so victims would impale themselves deeper trying to escape. Spiked beams called whip traps would swing from door frames with enough force to drive 6-inch nails through a man's torso. Giant maces made from clay-filled baskets bristling with razor-sharp metal fragments would drop from overhead on tripwires. The cartridge trap used a .30 caliber round mounted in a bamboo tube, triggered by stepping on a nail that would fire the bullet upward through a soldier's foot. One particularly diabolical innovation was the systematic spiking of rice paddies, where American patrols might take cover. As Birch had observed, wounds inflicted in the rice field slush were particularly serious because of the human and pig excrement used as manure. Amputations were almost the only answer to infections from such wounds. The Viet Cong had turned the very farmland into a weapon. Indigenous tribes contributed crossbows shooting arrows tipped with plant poisons that would cause paralysis within minutes, leaving victims conscious but unable to move or speak as they slowly suffocated. Some booby traps were designed to kill one person and maim several others, a single device creating multiple casualties and devastating unit morale. Perhaps the most bitter pill for American forces to swallow was discovering they were largely responsible for arming their enemies, and you'll now see just how thoroughly this betrayal undermined the entire war effort. South Vietnamese troops, whom Americans were supposedly training and equipping, became one of the largest sources of weapons for the Viet Cong. Corrupt officials sold American weapons to make personal fortunes, while garrison troops facing guerrilla attacks would pay protection money and ammunition, a standard price being 10,000 rounds per month for survival. Burchett described the extent of this generosity. When one looked at a regular soldier of the front, the extent of US gifts became impressive. His standard arm is the US carbine, but his comrades will be carrying Garands, Tommy guns, 37mm machine guns, bazookas and mortars, and in battalion-size units, highly appreciated 57mm recoilless cannons. The massive escalation under Lyndon Johnson only made the problem worse. More American troops meant more American equipment flowing to the enemy through desertion, corruption, and battlefield capture. By 1968, the scope of American failure became undeniable through statistics that reveal the true horror of fighting an invisible enemy. Official estimates put communist forces in the South at 134,000 at the end of 1965. By 1967, that number may have reached 280,000, though the CIA believed the actual figure was over 500,000. Rather than weakening the enemy, American escalation had strengthened them. Mines and booby traps caused 4,300 American casualties in 1967. In 1968, that number jumped to 5,800. The military analysts suspected the true figures were much higher. Several divisions reported that about half of their hostile casualties came from mines and booby traps, most made from American materials. Defense Secretary Clark Clifford admitted the devastating truth in 1969. Bombing by itself would not stop the war. We had already dropped a heavier tonnage of bombs than in all theaters of World War II. Yet infiltrators were coming in at 3 to 4 times the 1967 rate despite the bombing's intensity. America's technological superiority, which had won World War II, became a catastrophic liability in Vietnam's jungles, and you're about to understand why superior firepower actually made the situation worse. Heavy equipment broke down in a tropical climate. Sophisticated communications were jammed by weather and terrain. The massive bombing campaigns that should have crippled the enemy instead created more weapons for them to use against American forces. The war had become a grotesque feedback loop where American firepower created more enemies, American equipment armed the opposition, and American casualties mounted without meaningful military progress. Meanwhile, the Viet Cong fought with weapons that couldn't be jammed, broken by weather, or detected by technology. A bamboo spike was as effective as a sophisticated mine, and considerably more terrifying to encounter on a jungle trail, where every step could be your last. American soldiers found themselves trapped in what military analysts called leading with their chins, moving cautiously through terrain where every object could be a trap, every shadow could hide an enemy, and every step could trigger an explosion. Unlike conventional warfare where soldiers could see their enemies and measure progress through territorial gains, Vietnam offered no such clarity. Body counts became the military's desperate attempt to quantify success, but as one analysis noted, dead bodies do not mean destroyed infrastructure. Dead bodies, particularly those of innocent peasants, mean a strengthening, not a weakening, of the insurgent cause. Gordon Weiss captured the futility in his final letter. What could the Vietnam War have taught American planners? The war as we know it is still going on. We are still suffering about 750 casualties a week, and the war is still costing the American people about $70 million a day. He died before seeing the answers to his questions, but his words remain a testament to the impossible conditions faced by those who fought America's most psychologically devastating conflict. So yes, what the Americans dealt with was pretty bad, but wait until you see what the Russians went through in Grozny. Check it out in the next video.